Hey everyone, welcome to Judging for the Win. I'm Dave, and this is my daily ruling. Today's question comes to us straight out of the Judge Vault. If you saw the thumbnail or the title, you know I'll be talking about Reflecting Pool today, but the rulings will be relevant for any card that references what mana something could produce. This type of effect has been part of the game for a surprisingly long time, and I'm not just talking about the OG Reflecting Pool in Tempest. The first card that looked at the type of mana a land could produce was Felwar Stone, all the way back in the Dark. This mechanic came back on benthic Explorers and Alliances, and Squandered Resources from Visions was a key component of the Prost Bloom combo deck. So this wasn't just some wacky one-off, but a legitimate design space that saw periodic use. Since then, a lot more lands have been printed, and there are a lot more possibilities for stuff to work in non-intuitive ways. In today's episode, I'll go through the most interesting possibilities, but we'll start with a few basics. And before we get started, I'll mention that for all the questions today, I'm going to be assuming that no player controls any cards that could affect the answer other than the ones that are specifically mentioned. Actually, this is a standard assumption for rules questions, not just on my channel, but pretty much across the board. But I wanted to call it out especially today because it's a lot less plausible for some of these questions than it might normally be. First up, there is a difference between 1 mana of any color and 1 mana of any type. Colorless is a type of mana, but it is not a color. Therefore, while Reflecting Pool is able to see a wastes and tap for colorless, an Exotic Orchard cannot. Also, snow is neither a color nor a type of mana. It's a property that derives from the mana's source. The snow mana symbol represents a cost that can be paid with 1 mana of any type that was produced by a source that had the snow super type. All this is to say that neither Exotic Orchard nor Reflecting Pool would be able to make mana that could pay such a cost, no matter what other lands were in play. Next up, we've got a question straight out of the Judge Vault, since Reflecting Pool and the Vivid lands were in Standard together. What colors can you tap for if the Vivid land has no counters on it? To get an answer, we're going to have to take a look in the CR. This is the one rule that governs how effects like this function, so we'll be referring to it a lot throughout the rest of this episode. As you can see, the test of whether a permanent could produce a certain color or type of mana is whether any ability of that permanent could produce it if it were to resolve at that time. We ignore whether it would be possible to pay the cost to activate the ability. So that means even if the Vivid land has no counters on it, or even if the Vivid land is tapped, the Reflecting Pool is still able to tap for any color of mana. In the same way, it is immaterial whether it would be possible to activate the ability for any other reason. For example, if there was a Null Rod out, it would not be possible to tap your Ancient Den for white. But that ability would produce white mana if it resolved, so that means your Reflecting Pool can still make this color. It's less clear how this would apply to something like this Calciform Pools. After all, it is legal to activate its bottom ability removing 0 counters, in which case it would produce no mana. Even so, I and the other rules experts that I consulted agreed that it would make the most sense to rule that this land can produce white and blue, even with 0 counters on it. Another classic question is how these lands interact with each other, which at first glance appears to give some sort of infinite recursion paradox. Fortunately, this scenario is addressed by the rule and unambiguously answered in an example given afterwards. If a player controls an Exotic Orchard and their opponent controls Reflecting Pool, neither land can tap for any mana at all. If the Reflecting Pool player then plays an island, all the lands would be able to tap for blue. We can use the same principle to answer another variation of this question. If you have a Gaia's Cradle but no creatures, can your Reflecting Pool tap for green? Well, if the ability of Gaia's Cradle were to resolve at that time, no mana would be produced. Therefore, Reflecting Pool does not consider Gaia's Cradle as being able to produce green under this circumstance. Okay, now if you take a closer look at that rule, we can see something kind of interesting. Reflecting Pool does not look just at the abilities that your lands have printed on them, it looks at any ability the lands have. For example, a land that is enchanted with Abundant Growth will let your Reflecting Pool tap for any color. A Thespian Stage that is a copy of your opponent's Azorius Guildgate will allow your Reflecting Pool to tap for white or blue because the copy effect causes Thespian Stage to gain that ability. Likewise, lands that gain a basic land type gain the ability to tap for the appropriate color also. This means a Nihilia's presence on any of your lands would give Reflecting Pool the ability to tap for any color too. Now let's take a look at this Shimmer Wild's growth though. We can see that it does not give abilities to the land that it enchants, even though tapping a Plains enchanted with this card might result in a white mana and a blue mana being added to your mana pool. The blue mana resulted from the ability of the Shimmer Wild's growth, not from a land that you control. Therefore, the Reflecting Pool would not consider your Plains capable of adding anything except white. If you read carefully, you can see that all the abilities are considered, not just activated abilities. And in fact, it doesn't even have to be a mana ability. So Crumbling Vestige would be considered to be able to produce any color of mana. Another thing to note is that replacement effects can modify the mana that a land produces, and these are also taken into account by effects like Reflecting Pool. For example, any basic land plus Pulse of Llanowar will allow your Reflecting Pool to tap for any color. If you've been a fan of the channel for a while now, you know that if multiple replacement effects are applicable to the same event, the affected player can choose what order that they are applied. Any possible ordering of replacement effects can be considered. For example, if there was a Contamination and a Pulse of Llanowar out, the Pulse player's basic lands could tap for black if the Contamination was applied last, but they could also tap for any color if the Pulse was applied last. Therefore, those lands are considered able to produce any color. It needs to be a possible ordering of the replacement effects, though. And to see what I mean, let's say that Amy controls a Contamination and a Gemstone Caverns with a luck counter on it. What colors can the Gemstone Caverns tap for? Now, at first glance, you might have thought this should work exactly like the last example. Certainly, we also have two replacement effects, one from Contamination that wants to make the mana black, another from the Gemstone Caverns that wants to make it any color, but there's an important difference. Unlike Pulse of Llanowar, the replacement effect from Gemstone Caverns is an effect of its bottom ability that replaces part of what that ability does as it resolves. Now, this makes it a self-replacement effect, which complicates things. Now see, I mentioned before, if two replacement effects both want to apply to the same event, the affected player gets to choose which one goes first. But this isn't a completely free choice. Self-replacement effects must be chosen first, and therefore it is not possible for Amy to choose to apply the Contamination effect first the way you could in the previous scenario. Check out my video on Rest in Peace and Lapse of Certainty for more details. Accordingly, Amy's Naga Vitalist could only tap for black, not colorless and not any other color. Phew. For such a simple topic, there's a lot of variations, huh? Let's cool down with some challenge questions that I prepared to test your understanding. First up, what colors can a Tundra produce if it's enchanted with Evil Presence? Okay, so when an effect changes the type of a land and it doesn't use the phrase in addition to its other types or similar, that means you're completely overriding the old types. Tundra will no longer be a plains or an island, just a swamp. Accordingly, it will only be able to produce black. Now, suppose someone later plays a Blood Moon. What colors could the Tundra produce then? Remember that replacement effects, which affect the color of mana that a land produces, are taken into account when determining what mana a permanent can produce. There's just one issue. These aren't replacement effects that we're talking about here. They're continuous effects. You, therefore, cannot apply them in any possible order. There's only one specific order that these effects apply in the game. In the case that we're considering, that would be timestamp order. You can check out my video on Blood Moon plus Spreading Seas for a fuller explanation, but for now, I'll just skip straight to the result. We said the Blood Moon entered after the Evil Presence, so that means its type-changing effect overwrites the other one, changing Tundra from a swamp to a mountain. Accordingly, this means Naga Vitalist can only tap for red. Alright, same scenario, we've got the Tundra, the Evil Presence, the Blood Moon, all still in play, and we're going to play a Fertile Ground on this Tundra. What colors can it produce now? And so for this answer, we'll need to recall that only mana produced by an ability of that permanent is considered. The mana produced by Fertile Ground results from the ability of Fertile Ground, not Tundra. Accordingly, this land is still considered to only be able to produce red. Alright, last question in the set. After all this, Amy is sad that none of her stuff worked, so she plays an Abundant Growth on the Tundra. What colors can Tundra produce now? And finally, it can produce all colors. We'll observe that, unlike Fertile Ground, Abundant Growth functions by giving an ability to the Tundra. If this ability resolved, it could produce any color of mana. Therefore, the Tundra can produce any color of mana. Another thing to note is that this is true even if there's a Blood Moon or an Evil Presence out, and it works even if the Abundant Growth has an earlier timestamp because of how layers work. I talked about this in more detail in my video on Blood Moon plus Bootlegger's stash. Alright, so let's say that you have a Star Compass and a Wastes. Can Star Compass tap for colorless? Well, it is true that Wastes is a basic land and it could produce colorless mana, but Star Compass only taps for one mana of any color a basic land could produce. A colorless is not a color, so there's no way for Star Compass to tap for colorless mana at all. And speaking of colorless, let's say that Amy controls a Tundra and a Reflecting Pool, and Nick uses a Quarum Trench Gnomes against Amy's Tundra. What types can Tundra produce now? Alright, so in this case, we really do have a replacement effect that wants to modify what mana that the Tundra produces. You can tell because it uses the word instead. This replacement effect only applies if you're tapping the affected permanent for white mana, though. Other colors are unaffected. Now, this means the Tundra can tap for colorless mana or blue mana. In turn, this means the Reflecting Pool can tap for blue. Because Reflecting Pool says type rather than color, it can tap for colorless mana too. Next up, let's say that we have a naked singularity. What colors of mana could a tundra produce under this circumstance? Well, we can see that there are two replacement effects, one that says plains produce red, one that says that islands produce green. And note that because these replacement effects key off of tapping a land of the appropriate type for mana rather than tapping for a specific color of mana, each of these effects will apply no matter what color the tundra's controller says they're tapping for. That player can decide to apply these replacement effects in either order, with the net result being dictated by whichever one applies last. This means that a tundra would be able to produce either red mana or green mana. Finally, here's the last question that I've prepared. Amy controls a mana reflection and a damping sphere. What types of mana could her forest produce? Alright, so like before, there's two replacement effects that want to modify what mana gets produced. Unlike before, it is not possible to apply these in either order. Because the mana reflection effect causes the damping sphere one to become applicable, the damping sphere can only happen after mana reflection. This means that the forest can produce colorless, but not green. Pretty weird, right? And yes, this does mean that you could destroy that forest with a Break the Ice. Speaking of, if you'd like some more practice with this concept, I recommend my video on how Break the Ice works. You can find a link to all the videos I mentioned in the description. But that's all I have for you today. How did you do? Join me again next time for another ruling. Until then, I hope you have a great day.